In this video, I'll be explaining how to do the problems on the quiz. So starting with problem number one, uh, kind of a mess already. We're looking for the inverse tangent of negative rad 3. So what that means is it's kind of like Jeopardy where you get the answer. So the answer is negative rad 3 and you have to try to find the question. In other words, the question would be the angle. So anyway, so the angle we're looking for is an angle in between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2 in which the tangent of the angle is negative radical 3. And so looking between negative radical 2 or negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, tangent is negative in the fourth quadrant. Negative radical 3, the angle has to have a 3 in the denominator. So the angle would be negative pi over 3. And just a real quick note, why do we have to limit the answer, the angle, to an angle between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2? Well, that stems from restricting the domain of the tangent function, y equals tangent of x. If you remember, tangent of x goes through 0, 0, and it has vertical asymptotes at negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. But it also repeats every pi radians, and so to the right side of the vertical asymptote of pi over 2, if we didn't restrict the domain, it would just keep going on forever in both directions, go to the right and also go to the left. Well, that's a problem when we want to figure out, when we want to discuss and analyze the inverse tangent function. Problem because only functions that are one-to-one have an inverse. So, so it's kind of like Fahrenheit and degrees. So if it's 0 degrees, did I say Fahrenheit and degrees? Fahrenheit and Celsius. So Fahrenheit and Celsius, if it's 0 degrees Celsius, it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a one-to-one function, meaning if you know what the degrees Fahrenheit is, like it's like 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then you would know that that's 0 degrees Celsius. So you can go either way. Well, there can't be this ambiguity if you say, okay, well, what's the inverse tangent of one number? You can't just reel off a bunch of numbers, even though the tangent of a bunch of angles is negative pi over 3. So we have to restrict that answer, that value to only one, and we do that by restricting the domain of the tangent, thereby restricting the range of the inverse tangent. So if the domain of the tangent has to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, then the range of the inverse tangent has to be also between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So that goes back to studying inverse functions. And inverse functions, a function and its inverse, they like I always talk about reverse. So the x and y are reversed on both. So the x on tangent is the y on the inverse tangent. So that applies to both of the other functions as well that we study, the sine and the cosine. So if you look up here at the sine and cosine are also not one-to-one unless we restrict the domain. So the sine gets restricted between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, just like the tangent, because it's the most convenient. There's probably a more technical reason why we choose to restrict the domain to these two, but nevertheless we do. And then the cosine, though, if we restricted the cosine from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, if remember the cosine's graph would go down to the left like that, and it would not be one-to-one. If we restricted cosine to negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, it wouldn't be one-to-one. Not only that, but we would also be missing out on the negative cosine values. And so the closest, the, the the restricted domain would be then from 0 to pi. Therefore, we get all the positive values of cosine between 0 and 1, and all the negative values for cosine from 0 to negative 1, or from negative 1 to 0. So that's just a little background on why we are limited to a certain angle, and hopefully that helps you remember. Let me just do one more here and then I'll jump over to the next video for the next few problems. So cosecant inverse of 2. Well, cosecant is the reciprocal of the sine, so really what we're looking for is the inverse sine of 1/2. That's easier to kind of figure out if we convert the cosecant to sine. And so anyway, we're looking for the angle in which the sine of the angle is 1/2. So again, the angle has to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. The sine is 1/2 at that first angle, 30 degrees, or pi over 6. So pi over 6 is our simplified version of that expression.